everyone. Welcome to the Founders Foyer with me, Aishwarya. This foyer is full of conversations, the space where creators, founders, and builders can look for all the foundational concepts and support to grow their ideas into products. Okay, as soon as you put your product out onto the market, one major question that gets to you from literally everybody is, how's your product growing? It doesn't stop there because what's your growth strategy? Does your product have network effects? Did you get more leads? Where did you spend the money on? Did you do it on ads? I think this is going to be like a never-ending line of questions and discussions that we often get pulled into as product folks. But before all of that, what exactly is growth and how do you measure it? And what's the fundamental concept of product, sales, marketing, and the way all of them tie in together to help scale a product and make revenue? Because that's exactly what we'll be discussing today. Joining me is Casey Winters, Chief Product Officer at Eventbrite. Casey has earlier led product growth teams at Pinterest and GrubHub. He was also an executive in residence at Greylock, and he currently advises tech companies on how to scale and sustainably grow their business. Hey, Casey, thank you so much for being here on the Founders Foyer.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, super excited, and let's just dive into your journey and the background in growth. How did you enter the space? And particularly, when did this whole attention on product growth and scaling start from?
Yeah, so I would say I actually started my career doing growth. We just didn't have a name for it for the first 10 years I was doing it. So I started my career as an analyst at apartments.com, which was an apartment rental marketplace. And it was my job to measure all the work we were doing to drive leads to apartment buildings for effectiveness, basically, if they were a good cost. So these were things like search engine optimization, AdWords, affiliate marketing, email, which were all things I had never seen before. We definitely didn't talk about them in school back then. So once I got good at measuring those things, I naturally started working on optimizing those channels. But I didn't stop there. I started trying to work on changes to the site so those channels converted better, and going to focus groups to understand our users better and how we could compete with Craigslist, on product features. And it was then that I started to get the feedback from the company that I was this marketing and product hybrid, and that the company didn't really know what to do with that because those were two totally different departments. So what I did was I worked on a lot of intrapreneurial projects where combining those skill sets was an asset. So we launched a last minute apartment search product. We launched a rental homes product, and we launched a real estate version of apartments.com where I led all the analytics, business development, and marketing. So I was kind of trying to still leverage all of these different skills together. It wasn't until I joined GrubHub where I felt they actually understood me and what I was trying to do. So GrubHub's, food delivery service. At the time, it was 15 people, had raised a 1 million Series A. And they basically said, hey, we don't care what you do. You can change the product. You can optimize the product for SEO or conversion. You can spend money on ads. As long as it gets more people to order food, that's what we want you to focus on. But it was still called marketing then. It wasn't until Andrew Chen posted the essay, Growth Hacker is the New VP of Marketing, that I felt like someone out there in the ether understood me and what I was trying to do and was describing it effectively. But it wasn't even until Pinterest until I actually had the term growth in my title.
Awesome. Oh, I think it's like a mix of a lot of experimental, way that your career got started, because it sounds super exciting in terms of optimizing for stuff. And the best part is when you don't have the actual role and like you get to do a lot otherwise and sort of learn very experientially. So I think that's a very interesting thing that you mentioned. And I have seen Andrew Chen's article on growth. And I think that sets like the base for folks to understand, okay, so there is the product space and growth exactly means this. And maybe you could be doing this earlier and probably you just have to take notice of the fact that you did this earlier and like double down on what you're already doing. So and your example was perfect, I think, to match that as a definition. So sounds super good. And thanks for sharing. I think the term hacker is something that I was very curious about, because often when people talk about growth, they quite literally call it as growth hacking. So why is it that growth gets paired with the term hacking? And how do you define growth for, let's say, someone out there who's just going to come and ask you, hey, Casey, like, can you tell me what exactly is growth? I'm a new founder. So what are the components that I should know as a part of growth of a product?
Right. Yeah. Well, the term growth hacker was invented by Sean Ellis, and he was someone that was trying to help organizations better understand engineering leverage applied to what were traditionally considered marketing problems. And hacker had become almost an affectionate term for engineering around that time, probably due to some of Paul Graham's essays and book. And hacker also triggered the notion of like effectiveness. So this idea of growth hacker was someone who is effective in engineering growth instead of paying for it to grow a startup. Things like invite flows, user-generated content, conversion optimization, onboarding flows, things like that. I actually extremely dislike the term. I never use it because it implies a lone wolf, and great growth work happens with a team of engineers, designers, PMs, analysts, et cetera. So how I would define growth today is I define it as work that helps people experience the value you've already built in the product. So if you think about core product work makes the core product value stronger over time. It adds new features, it adds new value. Growth teams make it easier to experience that value that's already there. And that can be from acquiring more users, or reducing friction, preventing people from seeing the value, or adding friction that makes it easier to create more product value later. All things like that is what typically you think of as growth today.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And also, very interestingly, decades later, or at least I would say 10 years later, we still engineer onboarding, we still engineer user flows, and we still think about what's the better way to optimize somebody who's just signing up for my product. How do they have a good user experience? So I think coincidentally, we still work on getting those flows better, getting the whole UX better. And that itself is a part of growth, like you mentioned. So that is something that's not changed even after so many years. And it shows how much fundamental it is to providing that value from your product. And
well, growth work is never done, right? So it's something you're constantly working on, constantly improving, which makes it really fun, right? Because there's always a new idea to work on. There's always ways to get more people to use the product, or to get them more engaged in using the product. And we see even at the companies that have billions of users, it feels like they touched everyone. They're still working on growth every day in some form or fashion.
Yeah, absolutely with you on that. I think, we've seen examples from Uber where they have gotten to a lot of regions, but still, they are doubling down on what's the next set of growth activities that we can invest in, and what's the next thing that we've got to do. So I think, that really makes it super interesting to experiment. And, I get a sense of how it is. People think that, okay, so for growth, it's all around metrics, like, how do I get so many acquisitions? How do I bring in more leads? How many convert at the end of the day after going through the whole lot of funnel stages? But innately, I am with you on the value part of things, because often when concentrating on metrics side of things, people just forget that, well, is the product really giving any value in the first place? Like, are we really giving any purpose to the folks who we bring in as onboarding onto the product? So I'm so glad that you touched upon the component of growth to not just be on the metric side of things, but the core value that you as a founder and the whole product team on the whole gets through the product.
Yeah, there's a reason that startups should have a mission, right? Because if a growth team is optimizing just for the metrics, right, eventually they're going to have either a real like up and down trajectory, because there's no underlying product there, so it will grow really fast and then everyone will churn out. Or you might optimize towards something that actually doesn't really, help drive toward your mission, right? So when you think about those core metrics a growth team is optimizing for, a lot of, the early examples of this were just optimizing for MAU or signups or things like that. And that's not what good growth teams do. What good growth teams do is they find that key metric or metrics that indicate the user is receiving value, and they optimize for the growth in those metrics. So, for Pinterest, that was around getting people to save content, right? That was the core value metric. For GrubHub, it was ordering food, obviously, that one's pretty easy. Right. And, for Eventbrite, similarly, like buying tickets on the consumer side and creating events on the event creator side. So some companies, it's harder than others to identify like what those key metrics are you need to optimize for. For some companies, it's fairly easy, but yeah, traffic, signups, MAUs are generally not the right thing to optimize for, or you might optimize yourself into something that actually isn't delivering long-term value, and therefore it's probably not sustainable growth.
Yeah, yeah. I think like every brand, every product on the whole is very different market, very different target audiences and different activities that they do. And the example that you just stated takes me to the next question, which is you just mentioned how even the North Star metric for each of these products are very different. So what are your learnings being right on the growth team for GrubHub, Pinterest, and now Eventbrite? What's different about product growth from each context, like from the three companies that you work for? What's your observation from the growth context?
Right. So I think what you'll notice in my career is there's a particular style of growth loop that I've been attracted to, which I'll describe, but there's definitely also been some differences, right? So, some key things I learned across these companies. So take GrubHub. GrubHub was not the first online ordering food delivery service. There were many of them, most of which had started before GrubHub when I joined GrubHub. What we did differently to succeed is we deeply understood what it took to create a cross-site network effect in each location. And what a cross-site network effect means is that if you get more people ordering food, it will attract more restaurants to get more orders. And then when you attract more restaurants, it makes it easier for people to find cool things to order, right? So that's the network effect we're trying to generate. So we built a playbook around sales on the supply side and SEO on the demand side, where we take all the restaurant inventory, create these landing pages that show you, San Francisco Thai food or just San Francisco delivery. And that's how we would acquire, early users. And what we figured out is we needed to get to a certain number of restaurants per location to create effective landing pages, to rank well on Google, to get a high enough conversion rate so that those restaurants would stick around and we could actually trigger that network effect. And we were really the first company to figure out how to do that. And then once we had that network effect actually going, we could layer in more channels like paid search or, out of home or television. And all of those would have very efficient payback periods. So that playbook allowed us to outgrow everyone in the space. Pinterest, very different in some regards because Pinterest didn't make any money when I joined. So the idea of spending money on things like, Google AdWords or out of home or television is totally out of the question, right? Because you can't have a payback period where, I spend $50 and make those $50 back from the users I acquire in X amount of time if you don't have a way to make money from your users. So what a lot of people don't know about the Pinterest journey is that Pinterest growth had really stalled out in 2013 because Facebook turned off the Open Graph, which was Pinterest's primary distribution channel. Basically, anytime you save something to Pinterest, it was published to the Facebook feed, which other people would see that content, click on it. And that's the primary way Pinterest grew early on. So I was brought in to replace that growth channel with SEO while the company built out a lot of new products, which hopefully would have new growth loops. So from 2013 to 2014, the company built 3 new products to try to reignite growth. We built a Maps product, a Q&A product, and a messaging product. And none of them impacted growth at all. On the growth team, we ran a 2-day test asking people from SEO to sign up once they clicked on a pin or scrolled more than once on the page. And that alone had a 50% increase in conversion rate. So every graph in the company kinked upward. Build 3 new products, very difficult, no impact on growth. 2-day experiment to optimize conversion, 50% impact on growth. And we had other examples of that. Like we changed the pin it button, which was the primary way that you save things, the primary call to action. We just changed that to say save in every local language. And that alone had a 15% improvement in activation rate. So we did lots of other harder things to improve growth. But one of the key lessons learned there is that effort doesn't equal impact, right? If you find the core thing that's preventing you from growing faster, a very minor change can have pretty massive impact. And that's certainly something we found over and over again at Pinterest. So those were some things that were very different there. On the Eventbrite side, I've been here 3 years now, but the company early on grew primarily by event creators marketing their own events. So an event creator would come to Eventbrite, they'd set up their event, they'd set up, their ability to get paid, and then they'd go do a bunch of their own marketing to bring people to Eventbrite to transact. And what that did is it created a lot of external links to Eventbrite because everyone's linking back directly to our site. And of course, that's a primary feature of the Google algorithm to determine trustworthiness. So we started to leverage that trustworthiness by creating landing pages, aggregating these events, similar to the way we aggregated restaurants at GrubHub. And now today, 25% of the tickets that we sell come from that work we do to drive growth for the creator instead of the creator doing their own marketing. And of course, that started at zero. So what's the same in all of this is that I'm drawn to these companies that have great content, either coming from users in the case of Pinterest or coming from suppliers in the case of GrubHub or Eventbrite, and then aggregating it as a way to drive demand, usually through SEO. And this is something we call a content loop at Reforge, which is a company I work with that teaches growth and teaches product. But these all had very different business models, right? GrubHub was a true marketplace. Pinterest was a content network that would eventually make money through ads. And Eventbrite is something we call a SaaS-like network. It has buyers and sellers like a GrubHub, but we help with problems like monetization and efficiency, whereas GrubHub was just all about providing demand. So 3 different business models, but some very similar growth loops powering all 3 of them.
Yeah, that was super comprehensive. I think I had so many real-time data on, these were the kind of experiments that were run in each of these companies. And what really sounded super exciting to me is often when somebody is so new to growth, to understanding the growth concepts, they think that growth is all about, do I have to spend on ads? Do I have to go and put myself out there? Is it like budgeting? So how do I just get started? And what is really so actionable from what you mentioned is how each of this is painstakingly an effort from the team, like the collection of people, which we'll get a bit later on in the show, is how much of an effort it is from the actual team side. And, people just say the network effect is, we just get one user, they're going to bring in the next user, they're going to bring in the next user. But it's just not easy. It's just not that it's happening all externally. There's so much of internal work that goes on. And like you mentioned in each business model's case, where with Pinterest, it was a different kind of the UGC network that you had to build with the help of the loop. Whereas with landing pages examples for both of Eventbrite and GrubHub, I think it's super cool to understand that all of this is so organic. And it sort of, gets this total mind shift change for folks to think that investing in ads or just paid marketing is not the only way to go about getting that initial growth. So, go on. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I've spent a lot of money on paid marketing in my career, but paid marketing is an accelerant. So if you're able to craft a network effect in each city, like GrubHub was able to do, that's cross-site between restaurants and people who order food. Or if you're able to craft a data network effect in the case of Pinterest, where we can personalize results for every user as they come in. And if you come in and say you're interested in Chukka boots, we know exactly what content to show you because of how many other people we know are already interested in that. Then you can start to think about, okay, can spending money on ads grow my network effect faster and stronger than it would organically? And that's what we did at GrubHub, right? The primary network effect was driven by connecting restaurants and people who wanted to order food and growing that early on through SEO and sales. And then once that was growing, it's like, okay, now can we effectively layer in AdWords or, spending money on train ads or, spending money on TV that would scale that network effect even faster and profitably? And the answer in a lot of cases is yes. But when that's all you've got, when all you have is paid marketing, what tends to happen is early on paid marketing looks really good. You're targeting the best users you can find. They have high conversion rates. They have high lifetime values. And you're like, this is great. But then you need to find more and more users that are less and less core to your circle. And what happens is then your conversion rate drops a little bit and their LTV drops a little bit. So your payback period isn't quite as good as it used to be. And then you fast forward 4 years later and those numbers are underwater, right? You're actually never making your money back off your paid marketing spend. So the difference between doing that in a network effect business versus not in a network effect business is the network effect is making your product stronger over time organically, right? You just If I try to order food on GrubHub now, there are thousands of options and there were probably 50, when I first started, right? So even if I'm not as good of a user, the product is so much better through the network effect, it probably makes up for the gap. So I'm probably, even though I started ordering food in 2008, the people who are signing up now and ordering food for the first time probably don't look that much worse than me because the product's so much better. Whereas if you don't have the network effect, the users you're acquiring 5 years from now are certainly going to be worse than the users you're acquiring today. And you need to basically bake that into your growth model, right? So a lot of what we teach at Forge is, and you touched on this, is like network effects are not just this random thing that's either sprinkled on your business or not. You can create them. Are they suitable to every business? No, certain SaaS products are never going to have a network effect, but some do. Shopify has built a network effect with developers and their customers, right? So there are ways to make these network effects happen that make your business more defensible, that allow you to grow more sustainably long-term, but they require distinct effort. They require distinct understanding of what's pre-network effect and post-network effect, how to scale those. And if you could build your understanding like we did at GrubHub of like, oh, this is when liquidity hits, this is when the network effect starts, then you can be really focused on optimizing for that. And if you have to recreate that in every city, like we did at GrubHub, no big deal. If you only have to really create that once per country, like in the case of Pinterest, even easier, right? Like you have to do it less times. And that's something that I think in tech, we're still in the early stages of understanding how to do. People thought like network effect is this magical thing that either happened, you either got lucky or you didn't. And that's not really the case at all.
Yeah, totally. I think what people often see is the external jargon of things like, okay, it's network effect. I saw it in the other app. Let me also try it on my app. But what you just mentioned is a lot around reflecting whether it's something that you would need in your app. And like you mentioned, Shopify is something like on the B2B side, but they managed to have a network effect built onto them. And that's purely because they understood what was their core offering and whether they had value in what they're giving, and all the internal effect and efforts that went into bringing that loop. And, in Reforge's terms, it's like having multiple such loops and like a layer on top, which will let each loop, run by its own. At the same time, you have like the integrated approach towards having effects from each of those built in. So
yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So this takes me forward to one of the next questions, which is very, very related, is how do founders think about scaling the product? So we spoke about how it's not like a lone person's work. It does involve a huge team. So what is the starting point for all of this? Like, when can a founder or a very, very early stage builder understand that, hey, these are the signals for me to indicate that my startup needs scaling? And how do you set up an initial growth team? So like two loaded questions. But
sure. Yeah, well, the first thing every founder should be trying to do is find product market fit, of course. And I define product market fit in a very specific way, which is first, you need to be satisfying a target customer. And that satisfaction is usually measured by retention, which is them, continuing to find enough value in what you're doing to come back and experience it again. But that isn't always the case, right? Like apartments.com, if we help you find an apartment, you're not going to come back the next week to find another one, right? Like you're good for a while. So in that case, you need a separate signal that satisfaction is really being achieved. But for most companies, it's retention. So you figure out your satisfaction signal, right? And a lot of people think like, oh, that's the only thing that matters. Just get a retentive product and you're fine. And I don't think that's true. The second part, which we touched on a little bit earlier, is equally as important, which is that satisfaction that you create needs to create a sustainable acquisition loop. So acquisition loops are things that allow you to scale new user acquisition basically without bankrupting the company. So you need to be able to have that consistent inflection in the number of new users you're bringing into the product who are satisfied in a way that's, you're not going to run out of money trying to do. And, unfortunately for founders, there aren't that many sustainable acquisition loops. It's really sales, paid acquisition, as we mentioned earlier, user generated content and virality. Those are the four that tend to consistently work, right? And for sales and paid acquisition, you need the satisfaction that you generate to make you money that you can reinvest into, hiring salespeople or spending money on ads. that's the main kind of thing you're optimizing for. And for things like, user generated content or virality, you need your users in the process of being satisfied to either create enough content, like boards in the case of Pinterest, or to share with enough users, like in the case of, Uber with their referrals, or Snap with invites, to grow new users and make them all complete those same loops, right? So when you think about product market fit, you're saying like, okay, I have a product that people like, that people use, that either come back regularly, or I know they're satisfied. And with how frequently they're doing that, I can enable these acquisition loops to work and power me at scale. So those are the first two things I think about. And early growth is, all about the founder figuring this stuff out, right? You're not hiring a growth team when you're trying to find product market fit, right? You are basically, trying to learn all of these things yourself, right? And it's not until you find product market fit and you find which one of those acquisition loops is likely the one that's going to scale your business that you start thinking about bringing in people with growth expertise, usually in those channels so they can scale it. That might be a head of sales if it's sales. That might be, a growth PM if it's around, virality or UGC content. It might be a growth marketer if it's paid acquisition. All of those are potentially good avenues, and you're going to be building around those people as they, unlock opportunities and see things in the data that allow your company to grow.
Yeah, I think that sounds super interesting. And to me, it was a lot around how much of a clarity you have, like when it comes to the founder side, like clarity in terms of what does the product do, like how is it having the market fit, like you mentioned, and also clarity around what kind of a frequency does my product have in terms of usage, because there could be like cases where your customers are satisfied, like they just buy it once and they're like, well, I'm just happy for the next 6 months, next 1 year, and I'm going to come back only much later. So and I think growth is definitely going to, like, in terms of the loops that we were just talking about, it's going to be very different for a company or a brand that focuses on a very not very frequent use cases as versus, let's say, something like Pinterest where people can get every day, like, or every project on the whole.
Yeah, so figuring out the x-axis on that retention graph is pretty important, right? So for GrubHub, we found that people would order food a couple times a month. I think that's increased, now over a decade later, but at the time, that was the natural frequency, right? And Pinterest, when I joined, we're actually measuring retention monthly, and we later figured out that isn't really accurate. Like, we should move that up to weekly, because if our mission is to help you discover things you're interested in, people are doing that more often than a month. We based it on a month largely because magazines were how people found things related to their interests, and most magazines were monthly. But that's more of a limitation of like publishing than how things work on the internet, right? So we moved that up to weekly. And then there are some companies like Eventbrite where there's a wide variability in that answer, right? So we have some creators that are putting on events every day. We have some creators that are putting on events every month. Some creators we only see once a year, like the big festivals, right? So you have to segment those into different retention graphs, or else like the thing is going to look like a mess. Like it's not going to be very insightful. So figuring out the natural frequency of the x-axis of your retention graph, and then what metrics should be the y-axis, like saving for Pinterest or creating an event for Eventbrite. Those are really important questions, and you might get them initially wrong, and that's okay, as long as you can kind of look at the data and start to adjust toward the closest proxy to user value, because you might not have the perfect metric. Like for Airbnb, which is a company I advise, this was a lot harder because most people only travel once a year. So the x-axis is yearly, which means it takes forever to figure out if someone is going to come back. But the trip is you booking the trip is only a proxy for, did you have a good time on the trip? Did you enjoy the stay, right? So actually the review is a lot more indicative of, did people get satisfied rather than actually just booking, right? So in businesses like that, you have to rely on some of these like offline signals that aren't actually product usage to say, okay, I'm on the right track here. All of this is doable. It's just definitely can get more complicated for certain type of businesses. Airbnb and Eventbrite are some of the more complicated examples.
Yeah.
GrubHub and Pinterest, a little bit easier. But that's a really important thing to try to get right, is like, what retention graph or graphs am I actually looking at? And are they measuring the right thing for the product value I'm trying to create?
Yeah, that can totally make or break the way you look at your retention curves, right? Because often it's only from the sense of, okay, let's just do the monthly retention, and it's always even like the MRR, like what's the monthly retention, what's the revenue that we get per month. But that's not going to work for any product, like you just mentioned. And in fact, what I observed from the way you explained is, even for companies like Airbnb, where it was initially about, yeah, I take a trip every 6 months or every year. Now there's this concept of workation, where folks, right after pandemic, there's a lot of shift in the behavior. There's people just taking vacation, like in terms of the workation, every 2 to 3 weeks. So that kind of a segment for Airbnb is going to be very different from still that segment that takes vacation once a year. So like you just said, getting in as retention from different personas perspective makes total sense. Yeah,
this is a really great example for founders, because most people hate running low frequency businesses because you get so little data, so little signal compared to something, like a Pinterest. So if you have the ability to nail the value prop for an infrequent use case and sequence that to something more frequent, that works out really well in your favor. And especially with these network effect driven businesses like an Airbnb, the fact that there's so much inventory and the prices are, so available, can allow them to ladder up to a more frequent use case. In their case, a pandemic helped trigger a new use case there.
Exactly.
But when you're making travel cheaper, that was also leading to people to think about, traveling more often, right? Because they're just more affordable options. That's a great thing that Airbnb did. But yes, that ability to say, okay, we've got a great business, we're making things better and cheaper. Now that helps us create something even more frequent, down the line. Business travel would be another example for Airbnb that, they've had some success in as well. So that's look, there's nothing wrong with building a low frequency business, right? But when you think about the very largest businesses, they tend to find a very frequent use case. Uber, you need to go somewhere generally every day, right? For GrubHub, you need to eat something every day, right? So these high frequency use cases usually generate the biggest returns in terms of building companies.
Yeah, and it's pretty exciting to see that most companies are dealing with that. They are trying to understand what's the changing external factors like, and how can they get the frequency up and running with lateral use cases. And sort of reminds me of the conversation that I had with Ravi Mehta like a few weeks back, where he was trying to, we were talking about validating ideas before even getting into the product picture. It was just in the idea stage. What do you do?
Right.
I think we had a very interesting point about how to loop in the external factors and sort of understand what you need to do as from validating the idea using what's happening around you from the external sense. And I think that's going to pretty much match the same case that people are discussing now, how Airbnb made the pandemic shift as, getting a new use case in their product. So yeah, totally good example. Awesome. So I think another important point, since we're talking about product market fit and all about the users and how do you get them to pay, how do you get them to use, is monetization a very important part of product market and the channels in which you're promoting? Is the trial fit, is monetization an important part of that? And how do you generally generate revenue for, let's say, for the product that has very minimal use cases, as we just spoke about, or let's say a lack of interest in the initial period? How do you focus on getting revenue for such products?
Yeah, so I'd say monetization, as it relates to product market fit, it determines what growth loops are going to be possible, right? I don't think monetization is required for product market fit. So if you look at Pinterest or Facebook or Snap in the early days, they all grew for years without making money. But I would say they had clear product market fit during those years. So it's more about whether you are sequencing to a sustainable business model and company than whether you have it absolutely at this very moment, right? Ads, for example, needs scale. SaaS doesn't, unless the value prop is around gathering a massive amount of data or something. Like our marketing tools at Eventbrite, we need scale for that because we're using our data to more effectively, target who's going to buy tickets for you. than if you try to do advertising on your own. That's a scale value prop, right? Which is why it was our second product, not our first. For Pinterest, we were, I think, 5 years in before we tried to make $1, because we just needed to have like 100 million users to be attractive to advertisers. So anything you're doing to grow, if it's not scalable as a startup, that's okay, but it needs to be helping you get to a state where something is scalable growth. That might be building a network effect, like a GrubHub, or building enough data to personalize recommendations and ads like Pinterest and Eventbrite. But know what next milestone it's getting you to help you make the business more sustainable, in one incremental fashion, right? So that's how I think about monetization as part of the product market fit kind of calculus, right? And in terms of trying to make your first dollar and whatnot, it really depends a lot on what type of business you're building. Does the market exist or not exist? And there's a lot of really kind of custom questions you need to go through there, right? So, an example that comes to mind is Figma, right? So Figma is a company we invested in when I was at Greylock. It's a design tool that's now used by, it seems like, every product designer in tech. But obviously, when it launched, that was not the case. And I think early on, people were like, "Oh, well, how big a market is like product designers? Is that like going to be like a really important market that could build $1 billion business?" Which now sounds like a crazy question to ask. But at the time, it was definitely something investors asked. So early on, right, like they didn't have enterprise plans. The SaaS fee was a really small number. None of the revenue numbers looked particularly impressive, but it's about whether you're building the key tool for what is a very key function in every tech business, which is building a great user experience. And I think their core insight is that design is collaborative, right? Not just between other designers, but between your product manager and your engineers. So building a product that can be accessible from the web, that enables everyone to look at the most up-to-date version of the design and not send version 15A, out was really key thing. So, early on, you're looking at these SaaS revenue numbers. They're not very impressive. And now, you could probably go to a lot of these companies and say like, well, if I charged you 10x more for Figma, would you churn? And the answer would be absolutely not, right? So they're now building this pricing power. And how they want to leverage that, of course, depends on their loops and how fast they want to grow versus how much profit they want to make. These are all levers that founders can pull over time. But again, it's not about day one, whether Figma is making $50 per user or $5 per user. It's as we build towards a sustainable company 10 years out, what that's going to look like. And it might be $500 or $5,000 a user at that point in time, in which case that's going to be a very attractive business, right? And I think in their case, they are building a very attractive business. So if you could tell that story as a founder of what this is sequencing to, that is more important than necessarily how much money you're making day one. If you're bootstrapping, you're going to need to make some money day one, or else there's no way to fund the growth of the business. Or you might need to make some revenue to prove to investors that there's a lot more revenue to make. Something I always counsel founders on that I advise is the most important thing to building a sustainable business is the next milestone that's going to convince investors to give you more money to go unlock the next milestone of the business if more money is what's required. If more money is not what required because you have a great business model already, then just focus on the next milestone that helps the business. But if money's required to get to that, then your next milestone is whatever the people who have money that may want to give it to you think is the most important next milestone. And that might not be perfectly aligned, right? And that's okay, right? Of course, it's your job as a founder to convince them what the important milestones should be. But if they're like, hey, I just need you to see you make 10 million in ARR to give you more money, sometimes you got to like pivot your plan to show that you can make 10 million ARR or whatever that milestone is. And that's okay.
Yeah, I think that touched upon a lot of great anecdotes. And I really like the mindset that you just mentioned in terms of looking at the next best milestone or, where do you want to go? And a lot of this looks like how clear you want to set your priorities, right? Like what really matters to you as like if you're a founder or if you're a part of the growth team, what's the the most prioritized goal of that team, of that product, and what are you really caring about, and what do you want your customers to care about, like more than what you care about. I think what do you want the people who use your product to care about. And the examples that you brought with, I think all of them did that. Like they made the users care about what value proposition they were giving forward. So yeah, I think adoption, like you said, that really makes sense, because get your base stronger, and then take each step towards monetization. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. Awesome. So one of the other, like a large question again to you is, you often write and talk about the different stages of startup, and since we just covered about it, and also the mistakes that people often make in scaling up. Could you just explain that a bit more?
Sure. So startup founders and early employees have the biggest example of what got you here won't get you there that you'll like see in any business context. And there are all of these vectors where, as a startup reaches a new milestone, the most optimal way to get things done just changes. Like how the company makes decisions, for example. Early stage companies really have the founders make all the calls, right? It's about the mission that they're building. They're going to be involved in every detail, and they should be. But then when you get past product market fit and you're entering the mid stage, you have to start to delegate some of those decisions to your employees, right? And ideally at the late stage, founders are delegating every decision except the mission and vision, fundraising, and recruiting executives. Like anything besides that probably shouldn't be done by founders once you're a late stage startup, right? There are examples where that's not the case. Like Brian Chesky is very, very involved in a lot of detailed decisions at Airbnb, but that is very much an outlier, right? And might be suboptimal, right? It's working out for them, right? So hard to critique it, but not really normal, right? So that's just one vector. But then there's all of these other vectors, which is like which types of people you recruit, right? In an early stage startup, you're hiring a lot of hungry generalists. And then when you get to late stage startups, you're hiring like seasoned specialists, right? And in between, you kind of like, sequence halfway between the two as a mid stage, right? And then it's like, do you hire like managers versus doers? Like all of these decisions need to change as you scale up. How important strategy versus execution is, how important it is to do things fast versus well. Like all of these things shift over time. And no one tells founders when they've moved to a different phase of the business, right? So I was first exposed to this when we acquired our first company at GrubHub. I was put in charge of integrating their users into the GrubHub product. And at this time, GrubHub was definitely what I would call a mid-stage startup at the time. And as a leader, a lot of decisions were delegated to me by our founders, right? So I'm working with this new company that we've just acquired. And what I saw is that everything still went through their founders. And I realized, wait, this is why we are acquiring them and they're not acquiring us, because we figured out how to scale, our processes and scale our company, and they're still operating like an early stage company, even though they were making probably 10 million in revenue at the time. So when I got to Pinterest, I would say Pinterest was in like the mid stage. It was like 200 employees when I joined. And after a while of having some success and growth, I recognized that it had shifted to being the late stage, because I had also experienced that at GrubHub. I left shortly before the IPO. So I went to my boss, who at the time is the CMO. I got ping pong back and forth between the head of product and the head of marketing during my time there, but that's another story. So I went to the CMO and I told him, I said, look, I'm an early stage startup guy at heart. I try to, make lemonade out of lemons, but I recognize that we're moving into late stage, this company. So when you see me trying to solve problems in like a way that's too scrappy for our stage, I need you to just like slap me around or shake me a little bit and tell me to like hire 10 more people or do the thing that's like going to get us more directly to the goal. Because that's like a default bias I have, right? So, so you might want to, whether you're a founder or a startup employee like myself, recognize what your biases are, and then recognize when those biases aren't actually well suited for the stage the company is in. So fortunately, in my second startup, at Pinterest, I had a little bit more knowledge of these different phases. And I could be like, I know I'm still biased towards doing like the scrappy stuff, but I at least know that's probably not optimal for the company right now.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you actually wrote it down because this is something that most often founders really miss out, and like we don't really understand the change in behaviors that we have, and we often start with a set of processes and then we continue with the same, like even if we are 1 year down the line, 2 years down the line. So
yeah, there's no good process for building a company. There's a good process for the company at a particular point in time. And then if you're growing quickly, 6 months from now, that process is going to break and it needs to be like rebuilt with something slightly different for, the different scale. And I was definitely fortunate at GrubHub grew, triple digits year over year, 4 years in a row. So it just felt like every 6 months we had totally different scaling problems. So I got to experience that really natively. So then when I went to my next startup, which was Pinterest, or when I started advising, these other startups, I could be like, oh yeah, like you've now moved to this different phase. You need to completely rebuild X, like your data architecture, or you need to, hire a head of growth now, or, a head of product, and you can't be making all these product decisions anymore. And of course, this is advice that like founders can take or leave, right? I'm just like sharing one perspective. But I agree that like even today, there still aren't good tools for founders to get that signal of like, there's a change in how I need to operate. And there's still a dearth of people who can give, effective advice in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I guess it's also a lot of self-reflection from time to time. And like you said, get those questions answered, understand if there's a need to hire people, or understand if there's a need to change anything about what you're doing as a founder or as an operator in a startup, and take the necessary actions for it. So that makes absolute sense. And towards the closing note now, and just like a rapid fire question to you, the last question, which is, what do founders, let's say, startup builders who like us work on products mostly get it wrong about growth? 3 things if you have to mention to me.
Yeah, so I think the first, we've touched on this, is that they think growth is a marketing problem and not a product and engineering problem. Engineering is the purest form of leverage to solving any problem in building a company. So not applying, engineering thinking to the most severe problems you have at a company, which a lot of times is growth, is a major, issue. I'd also say not engineering growth into the core product experience is another one I see. There's this tendency, and there's nothing necessarily wrong about it, of thinking like, okay, well, I build my core product value and I make sure that's good, and then I think about growth. But what the most optimal founders do is, as they're thinking about the core product value, they're thinking about how that core product value is going to grow itself, right? As a piece of software or something like that. So you're starting to see more founders do this, but too many don't. They come to me and they're like, I have product market fit, but I'm not growing. And then my response is, well, then you don't have product market fit, right? That's like the definition, is you should be able to grow organically. And then the third, which we touched on a little bit, is just relying too much on ads. It's going to look really good in the short term and then really, really bad in the long term if you don't have another way to effectively grow the business, or to make the core value of the product stronger, to make up for the fact that, ads tend to target worse users over time with higher and higher costs.
Wonderful. Like a good wrap up of everything that we discussed, from the anecdotes and examples. It was a great session. Thank you so much, Casey. I really enjoyed it, mainly for the comprehensive stories we brought in from each startup that you worked on. And it was more practical in the sense that I'm glad that the listeners would get to understand what was the actual experiment that got run over there in those startups, and what was the result. And it's also coming directly from you, who's done those experiments. So thank you so much for spending time and sharing all of this with us on the Founders Foyer.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.